Okay, this is the first installment of the video lecture series for my students, Valley High School, on demography. And Friday in class, I think this was the last slide we looked at, and I had said to you guys that I would video the rest of this stuff for this unit so we could kind of get into some things that this week that might be a little more interesting for you guys to talk about in class. So we were talking about how it's projected in the future that roughly 60% of the world's population will be living in areas that are defined as urban, and that most of this urban growth is going to occur in the underdeveloped or the poorer parts of the world by 2030. Now, for the rest of this unit, we're going to adopt what's called a socio-spatial perspective. What this means is three things, and you're going to want to have good notes on all this that you're seeing, guys. Just treat this like in class, like I would have lectured it in class. Get some good notes on it. And I probably will ask to see the notes at some point, so do a good job with these. And you can stop and start these as much as you want, so that should help with your note-taking. So the socio-spatial perspective means, first of all, we're going to discover how settlement spaces have come to exist. Also, we're going to discover the role that various institutions, economic, political, and social, play in creating and changing these spaces. So these physical spaces that we define as urban can actually change and evolve. They can get bigger. They can actually shrink. We'll talk about that. And also, last point, we're going to discover the processes in which these spaces are given meaning by local inhabitants. So the people who live in these urban areas, how do they assign meaning? If you have a little clique or an enclave, a different, or in other words, an ethnic group of people who occupy a certain part of a city. Like, if you travel to New York, you would see Little Italy, or you may see Little China or Chinatown, whatever you want to call those areas. But they are occupied by specific ethnic groups. And how has it come to be that these ethnic groups have given these physical spaces their own meanings through the lens of their own cultures? So we'll try to talk about that. Now, to back up a little bit, cities became possible, first of all, when agricultural populations began to produce enough food to support the people who were not, that's a typo, directly engaged in agriculture, such as priests, artisans, and warriors. So we start to see a bigger division of labor, and people are freed up to do other things. Now, increases in subsistence technology, this is food producing technology, made this possible. The invention of the plow, the invention of mechanized farming machines that made farming easier. In other words, it took fewer human beings to produce the same amount or even greater amounts of food. So again, this frees people up to do other things. Not everybody has to farm. You don't have to have a bunch of kids to have bodies to work the land. At one time, cities were highly compact spatial forms with a distinct center. You had a central business district that dominated both economically and emotionally the urbanized areas surrounding it. So you had a densely populated center of the city, if you will. Now that's starting to change, and has actually changed a lot in our country recently. We'll talk about that more as we go. So once inhabitants ventured outside of the city, they would be very quickly traveling through the countryside. So it's not as black and white anymore. There's not a clear delineation between urban and rural. There's sort of a gradual progression. We talked about this a little bit in class too. You have a city, then you go to the suburbs, and then you kind of travel out to what are called the exurbs, and then you kind of get out a little bit further, and then you start to get out into the rural area. So there's not a clear line to cross that you're like, oh, now I'm in the city, oh, I'm taking one step, now I'm in the country. It doesn't quite work that way anymore, but it kind of almost did at one time. Now today the city has exploded, not just in the U.S., but in many places in the world. There's no longer a single focus on downtown. You don't have to go downtown to shop or to get what you want. You can go to the suburbs. You can go other places to get what you want and need in terms of entertainment, clothes, food, whatever you want to get. People live and work in widely separated urban areas. Fewer and fewer people are living within the large central cities. In fact, what you've seen in the recent decades in this country is that the center of the city has became so overcrowded that people started moving away Those who were in the middle and the upper classes, especially, who could afford to move away, would move out into the suburbs, leaving behind in these central cities largely poor minority populations, which you still see a lot of today. And that's why you have seen some of the decay in these inner cities and some of the social problems like drugs and gang-related activity and poverty, because what was left behind when people moved to the suburbs were those poorer populations who couldn't afford to get out. Today in North America, more than 75% of us live in cities, and I know that we talked about that in class. 9%, these numbers may be just a tad different than what I told you on Friday, but they're pretty close. Depending on what numbers you look at anyway, there's going to be a little bit of variance. 9% of the world's population lived in cities in 1900, 30% in 1950, 47% of the world's population in 2000, and today 50%. And it's projected that by 2025, and we're 10 years away from that, almost 60% of people in the world will live in what are defined as urban areas. Now, the human species has existed on Earth for at least 100,000 years, but cities began to develop about 10,000 years ago. So within the continuum of history, cities are more of a recent development or a recent phenomenon. It wasn't until about 3,000 years ago that cities became relatively numerous and inhabited by significant numbers of people. Historians have studied cities for a long time, for centuries. Sociology, however, was the first of the academic disciplines to scientifically and systematically study cities. So we were the first social science, or any science, to really study the city from a scientific standpoint in a very systematic fashion. And we turned, as sociologists, our attention to cities in the late 1800s. If you remember, we talked at the beginning of the semester about some of the big people in sociology, our founding fathers like Marx and Weber and Durkheim. A lot of these early scholars and sociologists thought that the cities were not very good places. They were dangerous places where these factories were popping up and people were working these long, horrific hours with pollution and unsafe working conditions, and children were working 80 hours a week. Just life expectancy was very, very low. Quality of life was not great either in these early cities. So the early sociologists thought these were not very good places. In some ways, they certainly were not. Unless you were at the very top of the food chain, then you probably were living life a lot better than the rest at the bottom. Now, regarding urban growth in global context, growth rates are the highest in the developing world. In other words, the poorer nations, the poorest parts of the world, you see the highest growth rates in terms of people. Urbanization is an unmistakable trend everywhere. We're seeing, regardless of whether we're looking at more developed countries like the United States or underdeveloped parts of the world like we've talked about, like on the African continent or in India, there's an increasing proportion of these populations that are being defined as urban. That's the unmistakable trend that we're seeing everywhere. And what we're finding is again, especially in underdeveloped parts of the world, poverty and disease are the result of urbanization for many people. Now, in industrialized countries, more advanced countries like ours, we've come through that industrial revolution period. We've come through those horrific working conditions and pollution and child labor and all those horrible things that decreased life expectancy and decreased quality of life. In the underdeveloped parts of the world, however, they're just, in a lot of these places, they're just now starting to go through their, for lack of a better phrase, I hate to say industrial revolution, but they're going through their own shift, let's call it, shift from agricultural to more industrial types of economies. And with that, we're seeing some of the same problems in the underdeveloped countries that we went through during the Industrial Revolution. Now, because cities concentrate everything, I'm going to do a quick, okay, sorry about that, guys. Now, because cities concentrate everything human into a relatively small space, they intensify the effects of all of these things that we talk about in sociology. Class, social class that is, race, ethnicity, gender, things we're going to discuss individually as we go through the course. So cities magnify and intensify all the social issues that we talk about in a sociology class. Strong community-based neighborhoods have weakened in recent decades, and some areas have disappeared completely because of urbanization. Now, I'm going to go ahead and call that the end of the first part here of the rest of the demography lecture for Valley High School. Thanks.